afternoon. Today is November 13th, 2018, and I am Faith Ellis. Today we are interviewing Gilbert Everett Ellis III. Helping us with the interview is Jim Mills, who's our videographer, and Daryl Bladen, who's taking notes. And did I introduce myself? I am Faith Ellis. So, Gil, I'm going to start and have you tell me, why don't we start
with... I thought maybe that what I could do to begin this interview would be to lay out a little background about my life in an encapsulated form for the past 75 years. I was born in Orleans, born in Cape Cod Hospital, lived in Orleans the first 2 years of my life through 1945, and my dad moved into my grandmother's house in Brewster in 1945. I moved with my mother and one sister. I had another sister a couple of years later. And so I grew up in Brewster. I lived in Brewster. I went through the Brewster Elementary School system. I went off to DY High School. I went off to the University of New Hampshire, got a bachelor's degree in biology. I began teaching at Harwich High School. I went into the military for 2 years, served a year in Vietnam, came back, got a job at Harwich High School, taught there for 21 years, worked on my master's degree at Northeastern in 1979 in physiology, took a job at a small university outside of Miami, Berry University, relocated down there part-time during the academic semester and completed my doctoral degree at Nova Southeastern University, and I ended up as an associate professor of physiology at Berry University. I retired in 2016, gave my last exam on May 3rd of 2016, came back to the Cape. I'm pretty happy here right now. So that's been the elongation of the cycle of my life. Now I'm going to try to fill in some of the earlier gaps to complete the history of the early part of Brewster. And I'm not going to concentrate too much on my later years. Somebody else can do that, right, Faith?
Yep,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if that's helpful, at least here I am. So.
Okay, so back to 1946 when you were born.
Yeah, 43.
43.
Yeah.
So tell me about your father and his roots here in Brewster.
Okay, my dad was born here in 1888 and was an aspiring young real estate man, had a father who was a fisherman and a farmer, kind of took up with him a little bit, but was fortunate enough to go to Brewster High School, graduated from Brewster High School in 1906, and if anybody's wondering where Brewster High School was at that time, it was the building that used to be the Brewster Plastics building, which is now an office building for a number of different companies that work out of there, Bennett Surveying and some companies. That was Brewster High School. Graduated in 1906 and went off to Tufts College, was an electrical engineer, graduated from Tufts College in 1910. Took a job took several jobs over the time that he graduated. He went to New Jersey. He worked in the Boston area. He actually worked, I believe, although I think maybe Faith can confirm this, he worked for Thomas Edison, making electrical switches, which at that time in history they were completing the electrification of big cities and towns. And they needed these electrical switches to be able to turn the power on and off, and I know he worked on those for some period of time. Moved back into the Boston area, worked in Quincy, worked in Boston, and actually met his first wife in that area. I'm not good at this right here. Faith may have to help me with this. But he met his first wife, Faith, was a student at Simmons College. And did they meet while they were going to college together?
They did meet.
Okay, so I messed that up a little bit, yeah. So they met while he was at Tufts and she was at Simmons, and then he went off and took some jobs, and then they married later on I'm not sure what date. But then and you want me to continue with that?
Yes, a little bit, and then a bit about your grandfather, because that's important as well. And then
so my grandfather, my dad's dad, on that side, the Ellis side, he married a Cahoon, Lydia Cahoon. She was my grandmother. And they lived in the Cahoon estate, which was the house that used to be on Route 6A in Brewster at the entrance to the Ocean Edge development, to the villages at Ocean Edge. Oh, that house had a long history. It was actually constructed, as Faith did the history on it, back in 1770. And it stood there on 6A as kind of a landmark in the Ellis home all the years that I grew up, and even after that, until it was finally, it was sold to several times and took up some little businesses, and later on it burned and had a fire in it. And at some point in time, I don't think I ever did contact the Brewster Historical Society, but I thought it was kind of a historic building. And I went up to the people at Ocean Edge and asked them if I could have the house. And the guy said, sure, if you can get it off the land in 30 days, because otherwise we're going to bulldoze it down. So I didn't have a lot of money, but I made a little loan through the Cape Cod Bank and Trust, and I hired Mike Smith from Orleans to disassemble the unburned portions of the house. And what it turned out to be was this 1770 post and beam house, all held together with pegs and wood and some old nails. So we stripped it down to the superstructure, or to the inside structure, which was the post and beam, and stored all that material in some trailer trucks. And I thought what I would do with it would be to reconstruct it, and I did about 4 years later on the corner of Ellis Landing Road and 6A. And I don't know if these are good, Faith, or not, but
Yep.
this is actually a photograph of the house as it exists today. You might recognize it being on the corner of 6A and Ellis Landing. And I lease it out for some office space. But this is exactly the way that house looked. It was an old, Cape house with an addition that was put on later on, central fireplace, old chimney, 3 fireplaces, one in each major room downstairs. And I grew up in this house, but it wasn't located there. It was located up on 6A a little further. So that was my grandfather's house. He was a fisherman. He was a farmer. He had weirs off of Brewster, and he used to take the ox cart out and gather up the fish, bring them back to the old house on 6A, and behind the old house there was an ice house, an old barn. And they used to bring the catch up there and ice it down and, I guess, ship it out wherever they could to sell it. And so my grandfather was kind of an industrious little codger type of a guy, I'm sure. He owned a lot of land. He invested heavily in real estate. So he owned land in Brewster, Orleans, Eastham, Truro. He owned a lot. He put his money in land, and every time there was a chance, he bought some land. And I didn't really ever know my grandfather because he died in 1943, the year I was born. And my grandmother died at about the same time, so I never really knew my grandparents on my dad's side. And actually, to be honest with you, my dad died as a fairly young man, 63 years old in 1953, and I was only 8 years old. So I never really knew my dad or my grandfather or my grandmother on my dad's side. So that was kind of an interesting twist too in the growing up part of Brewster, because kind of put the onus on my mother to take over where a dad would for a young boy who was, growing up in a community where they had father, son, Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, basketball, baseball, Little League, and all that stuff. That was usually a father-son thing. But for me, it was always a mother-son thing. So it was quite a bit different. Although, everybody was always very receptive and respectful, and it worked out actually pretty well, I think. Although I can remember some times when it was a little embarrassing, when all the boys would be there, the Cub Scouts, and the fathers would get up and get the Webelos badge or the Wolf badge, and then Mr. Packett, who was the scoutmaster, Manny Packett, he'd say, now, Clara, you come up and with your son and expect the sword. And I don't know, it was always a little bit embarrassing to me, but I don't know why it should have been, but I guess it just was. So.
So tell us more about your mom.
Oh, my mom, okay. My mom was a nurse. She was a Canadian citizen. She was born in Nova Scotia, little mining town, Joggins. Been back there several times. Quite interesting. There's actually one of the World Heritage Centers is in Joggins, and it goes down deep into the earth because there's a lot of fossils there, a lot of dinosaur fossils. So they have a beautiful World Heritage Museum in this little podunk town in Nova Scotia called Joggins.
How do you spell that, Gil?
Joggins.
Joggins, Nova
Joggins,
Scotia.
Nova Scotia.
Okay.
She came to the U.S. and went to nursing school in Portland, Maine, became a registered nurse, and practiced in Maine for a short period of time. And some of her girlfriends and she decided they'd like to go to Cape Cod for one summer. So they came to the Cape, rented a house on Lake Wequaquet, up on off of 6, coming down the Mid-Cape Highway, you can see it. Was it Wequaquet?
It's Wequaquet.
Yeah, Lake Wequaquet. And she ended up taking a job at the Cape Cod Hospital. And she was a nurse there for a number of years, and that's where she met my dad, I believe, because he had been in the hospital. So she met him there. And then they were married in the late 30s, had 3 more children. My older sister, Carolyn, who lives up here on Alden Drive, myself, and my younger sister, Nancy, who passed away at age 46. She was also a nurse. She had a major brain aneurysm. She was down in Florida at the time. And there was just no hope of saving her, but she was a cute kid. So that was a pretty upsetting thing. But of course, in the interim, in 1953, when I was 8 years old, and my dad passed away. So he died up in the Cape Cod Hospital. He had some coronary heart problems. He had contracted hepatitis. He had prostate cancer. A lot of things going on. So I don't really remember much about my dad, but I'll tell you one story. It's not a good story, but there were some good stories, I think. But the one story that I have a vivid memory of was that I can remember as a young boy getting up in the morning, and he was alive when I was 6 years old. I went to first grade, and 7, 8 years old, I went to second and third grades in Brewster Elementary School. But getting up in the winter mornings, and my mother would always have a pot of oatmeal in the double boiler on the wood burning stove out in the kitchen. That was always going with wood, and later on we had coal. And I used to get a bowl of oatmeal, which I liked, the oatmeal, okay. But then he'd take a soft boiled egg and crack it in the bowl of oatmeal, what was left over with the milk in it, and he'd want me to eat that. I mean, I couldn't do it. And he would make me sit there until I ate that. You're gonna eat your breakfast, you're gonna eat your breakfast. And I remember always thinking back on that, and oh God, I had a hard time getting through that boiled egg coming out of the oatmeal bowl. It wasn't cleaned out, I didn't eat all the milk out of it. Just a thought.
That is too.
But in the interim, when we moved from Orleans to Brewster in 1945 and lived in the Cahoon House, he had an electrical store, which was located on Route 6A, out in front of the Cahoon House and a little bit to the west. Faith and I have been trying to get some old pictures of it. It's very difficult to find. The building's still, my dad, he was an electrical engineer at Tufts. I actually should have brought, and I didn't, but I have some of his old mechanical drawing sketches that he did of lathes, of screws. No computers in 1906 and 7, 8, 9, 10 at Tufts. So they used to do these elaborate mechanical engineering drawings all by hand in India ink. I have some at home, I should. I'm going to bring one and give it to Faith and she can put it in the archives. I just came across one. It was a tool that he had to draw for one of his classes. I don't think grades came easy then. I think if we talk about grade inflation, I don't remember seeing many A's on his drawings. They were mostly B's and C's.
Yeah.
But I mean, these were complex things. I mean, I don't know, but anyway, when he came to the Cape, he opened up an electrical appliance store called Ellis Electric. And there was an old sign that hung on the front of the building, and it had some neon lights on it, and it had his name, Ellis Electric Company. And it hung on the front of the store. And the store is presently, at some point in time after my dad died, her dad, Ted, my half-brother, kind of took over the electrical business, but he didn't want to stay with it. It wasn't what he wanted to do. And he was also an electrician. And he went off to work for some other people. And apparently, from what I understand from Faith, he traded the store to Alvin Holler, who was another resident of Brewster, who moved the store up on Route 6A across from Bassett Lane, and you can see it sitting in there behind the old Holler house in amongst a group of weeds and trees, and it's grossly dilapidated. And I've often thought, I'll get too old though, I think, it would be kind of interesting to get that old building out of there and maybe bring it back down on 6A behind the old house. I don't know if I'll ever do that or not, but that was his store. And he dealt out of that store electrical appliances. He was the sole distributor for Westinghouse products on the Lower Cape. I think even all the way up to Hyannis. So if anybody in Truro, Provincetown, Eastham, Wellfleet, Orleans, Brewster, Dennis, Yarmouth was going to buy a new refrigerator, they came to Brewster. They came there to his store. And they'd ship them in, I can remember. So we used to have a great time out behind the store because when they shipped the refrigerators in, they'd come in big boxes with wooden sides on them, but cardboard in the middle. And he used to take the wire and cut it and open up the boxes and leave all the boxes up behind the store. And we used to get the boxes and make forts out of them and play in them and we had a great time out there behind the store. I can actually remember one time out there with my bare feet and I stepped on a piece of that banding wire and gashed my foot. Quite a scene that was. So that store stood there for, I don't know, until 51.
53.
Until 53. Until 53, then it was moved. So that's kind of my mom and my dad's side of the family there. And then I guess the rest of the, well, you tell you.
Well,
where
so
do you
my
want to go
next
now?
question is more about your immediate neighborhood
Mhm.
and your childhood friends. So,
The Brewster I'm gonna go from like 40, I think I can remember back to when I was 4 or 5 years old. Because I can remember playing in the snow outside the house in 1948, I would have been 5. Then, of course, in those days, there was no K, so you didn't go to K, there's no kindergarten. Brewster Elementary School was 1 through 8. So I grew up in this little town, Brewster. I'm not exactly sure on the census figures, but I'm just going to throw out a figure that in 1945, when we moved to Brewster, the population of the town was around 800 people, year-round residents, 800. It was that in 1950. It was pretty much that in 1960. So all the years that I grew up in Brewster, the population was fixed. That pretty much means that the school population of students was also fixed. And I can kind of recount that by looking back at my years in the elementary school, going through grades 1 through 8. I can even remember all my elementary school teachers, right in order. I mean, I'll recite it.
go ahead.
Grade 1, Mrs. Livesey. Grade 2, Mrs. Hooper. Grade 3, a fill-in, Mrs. Carver. Grade 4, Isabel Laporte, one of my favorites. Grade 5, Lillian Callahan. Grade 6, Mrs. Dunn, Mr. Very, and Mr. Kane and Mr. Burse. In grade 6, we had a big change. We got to change rooms. In the triangle at the old town hall, I know right where the rooms are. So we go from, that was a big thing, because when grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you stayed in the same classroom all day long with the same teacher. We did have supplemental music teachers, art teachers that would come in, but the same teacher. And Ozzie Burris, our math teacher, he was also the principal of the school. Mrs. Dunn was a very, very strict English teacher. Mr. Kane taught social studies and science, and for 1 year, we had a teacher that came in and taught phys ed. His name was Mr. Very. And actually, he was also replaced by Mr. Chapman, another phys ed teacher. But we had no gym or anything in the school, so most of our activities were outside. So I have the greatest memories of growing up and riding my bike to school in the spring and the fall, slushing through the snow some days, but generally going over by the old tower house and up a couple of blocks, a couple 100 feet, and waiting in front of Murtis Foster's grocery store to catch the bus. And the bus would drive us up the road a mile and let us off and pick us up. In the cold of the winter, you take the bus.
So Murtis Foster's store and house is now what's known to everyone as Foster Square.
Foster Square, yeah. There used to be a little line of stores there. There are pictures of it. And Mrs. Foster owned several, on a row, she owned 3 or 4 stores. One was a little grocery market, the next one was a liquor store, the next one was a post office, and the next one was a small news store where they had cards and newspapers and magazines. Next to that was the Gulf gasoline station. That was also Mrs. Foster's. So she owned that little row down there. Now that's pretty much been demolished, and now that's the Brewster.
It's Cumberland Farms.
It's Cumberland Farms.
Yep.
And it had a name in the interim too, between the time they knocked it down and rebuilt it, wasn't it? Brewster Country. I don't remember what it was, but anyway, that was something that was there for a long time before it became Cumberland Farms and the other associated complexes that are there now. And then, of course, the school year went by, and I pretty much had everybody that was in your class you knew. Actually, you knew everybody in the school. There were 106 students in 1 through 8. So that's like, what, 8 grades, that's roughly 15 students in a class. I had 16 students in my class in grade 1. I had 16 students in my class in grade 8. I had 18 students in my class in grade 7. What happened? And in my grade 7 year, the McGregors moved to town. And they lived down in East Brewster, close to the Orleans line. And they had 3 children. Dougie, he was ahead of me. And Ann and Ellen, they were twins. And they moved into town for 1 year during my 7th grade. So we had to get 2 extra desks in the 7th grade classroom. It wasn't easy, there wasn't much room in there. And these were the student desks that sat, with a little desktop and the chair. And many of them were bolted to the floor. But we got some portable ones in there, I think, for Ann and Ellen. Then they left, they took off. So during the school year, it was in and out of school. During the summer, it was out in the summer. You're up in the morning, got your shorts on. Now, I guess I have to say I didn't do that when I was 3 and 4 years old, but pretty much when you were growing up, when you were in the 2nd and 3rd grade after school, you go out and play, There were not a lot of organized activities, not like it is today. So you had to pretty much make your own play. So I was into sports a little bit, not a great athlete, but a lot of my friends that lived in the neighborhood, in the fall we'd go out in the field and play football. Nothing organized, just we do it ourselves, And then in the winter we'd play basketball. We'd sometimes skate on some of the ponds, but that wasn't a big thing. And in the spring, we play baseball out in the field. We were
When
fortunate.
you talk about the field, what field are you talking about?
Next to the house that I grew up in, the old Kahuna estate, which was on 6A. Okay, the field that I used to play in was where the Ocean Edge building is now. The white building that goes into the development of Ocean Edge. It's not Ocean Edge, I keep calling that Ocean Edge.
It's the villages.
The villages of Ocean Edge.
Yeah.
They have a Greek revival building there, a white building, and that is, well, there was no building there. That was a field, an open field, and that's where we used to play out there. And from there, we'd run up in the woods, go over the railroad tracks, go up to Blueberry Pond. Nobody lived up there. There was no houses. The only houses that were in Brewster basically were the ones that were along 6A. So you pretty much knew everybody in town, and my closest boyhood friend lived across the street from me. He was a Daly. His parents lived here in town all the years I did, and that was...
so we have a picture of
yeah.
you and him, and
Yeah.
I have it scanned, so
Okay.
just so you can
Yeah.
talk it.
This is
about
a
it.
1947 picture that came from a book we had of some early childhood memories. And this is Skip. His name was Walter Daly. And he and I were close friends. We'd play every day. We'd always be together. But just up the road a little bit, Faith lived just up the road a little bit, but she was too young for me. And her older brothers, Chip, even he was younger. So we didn't really play with him that much. But next door to Chip was Roland Hall, and Billy Hall was a friend of ours. Then a little further up was Robert Ellis, my half-brother. His son John, he played with us. Up a little further, Arthur Dickey, Roger Dickey. Then we go up a little further, Ozzie Burris, Bunny Burris. And then we had all the kids in town. They didn't all live right down there where I lived, but they'd get on their bicycles. And they'd all, for some reason, our house, the house I grew up in, seemed to be the focal gathering point for all the young people to come. And my mother was always receptive. She always had cookies and milk, and there were unwritten rules in those days within families. If you went out to play in the afternoon after school, you had to be home by dark, okay? And you did. Everybody knew. They left. They didn't hang around. They got on their bikes and went home. When it was time to go home, it was time to go home and eat supper and do your homework. Sometimes in the winter, in the middle of the winter, if we were on vacation, like the Christmas vacation, we'd go, there was a young man who grew up on Route 6A just in the house that sits up on a hill to the west of the Brewster Coffee House. And that was where the Burses lived. Osborne Burse. He was the principal of the Brewster Elementary School for forever, until he moved over to Yarmouth, but he was always principal. And he was a stern guy. He didn't mess with Ozzie. You knew you were in trouble if you got called down to the office in the school and Ozzie was there. You were going to get the strap. I got it one day. I'll tell you.
For what?
I don't remember. I think Roger Dickey and I had a little altercation on the playground. And he hit me or something with a stick, and I hit him. And next thing I knew, Mrs. Callahan was in there, and she sent me down to the office. You go in the paper room in the office where they stored the paper, the metal shelves, and Ozzie would come in and quiz you a little, you know. And he'd point his finger at you and take his belt off, give you a good whack on the butt with his belt. Now, I mean, we could talk about that, you know, the impropriety of that, where we are today with that, but it wasn't unheard of in those days. And he'd call my mother, and I'd get another lecture when I got home from my mother. So it was kind of an understood thing that the parents of children were kind of in control. You know, you weren't gonna play a game, pit one of them against another. So here's my point: if you did something wrong in town, you were in trouble because everybody knew about it. The word got out and spread fast. The postmaster of the East Brewster post office, his name was Arthur Coakley. He lived in the little house that is now an accounting office.
Mm-hmm.
Can't think of the name of the guy's accounting, but it's right next to the Brewster Farms country store there. Forget the guy's name. I should know. He's my wife's accountant, but I don't know. But that was the Coakley house. Arthur was the postmaster in Brewster for years. He's up at 6 o'clock every morning, checking things out in the lower East Brewster. He'd go up to the post office. He'd see all the kids walk up the street, get on the bus, or not get on the bus, or walk by to go to school. And he kind of knew everything that was going on down that end of the town. And he made a point of it. If he saw you do something wrong, he'd call your mother. He'd call your mother or your father.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knew. There were you couldn't get away with anything, you know. So I always remember thinking back in those days, okay, can I tell a little story?
Yeah, we love stories.
Okay, here's a story. Probably 1950 or so. There was a little village down in East Brewster called Smith's Village. And it was a little area where there was a group of houses, small, you know, little cottage-style houses. And there were a lot of people that lived down in that area by the name of Smith. And they had, you know, there were 4 or 5 families, I think,
Mm-hmm.
probably that lived down in there. And, you know, you look back on it, and they didn't have a lot. They had very little. You know, you can imagine. I mean, they didn't have all the things that I had. You know, I wouldn't say I was a spoiled brat or anything, but I was a lot more fortunate than some of those kids were. And there was one guy down there who was, one of the Smiths. I don't remember his first name, but they called him Iron Mike. And he had some psychological problems, you know. And of course, in those days, there was nobody to take care of him except the family. But he'd come out in the morning, and he'd walk up to the post office, to the East Brewster post office, barefoot, middle of the winter. He'd walk up on the edge of the road barefoot. And I guess I wasn't the only one, but kids used to, I have to admit I did. We'd make a snowball and throw it at his feet. Pretty mean. But we would do that, and he would just walk right on by. And of course, Arthur would come out and tell us, "You boys don't do that. I don't want to see you doing that anymore." And the postmaster, he'd lecture us, man. And we were shivering, you know, scared. You know, it was always fearful as to what was going to happen. You knew that I knew all day during school is that, what's going to happen when I get home? My mother's going to be telling me about Iron Mike, and you guys should don't bother that man. Oh, so anyway, so little stories like that crop up every once in a while. So I knew every young boy that was in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grades, and then, you know, that time we knew all the kids in town. And then some of the kids lived up at the west end of town, Alan Doe, and Bobby Bates, Jimmy Coogan. Jimmy Coogan's an interesting kid. He grew up right here in the old
Joseph Lincoln
House. He grew up right here in the Joseph Lincoln House, and his dad was the bus driver for a while, Mr. Coogan. And Jimmy's now does a lot of writing for the
Mhm.
Historical Society, I believe. He writes a column for.
He writes a column, and he's also written a book that's a kind of his memories of Brewster.
Of Brewster, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And he was a friend of ours growing up, and so we used to, pretty much roam the town. And then down off of Tubman Road, there was a character by the name of Phil Tubman who lived down there. And his dad was a farmer, and he had an old farmhouse up off of Tubman Road. And we used to go up there, and the things I remember about Phil was kind of a hellion. Always into racing cars. Even before he had a license, he had cars that he'd race around in the field up there. And the thing to do was to get into them with him, and he'd take you for a ride. And you'd wish you hadn't gone, because he'd smash into trees and small trees and just terrify you doing these donuts and up in his farm. And then they used to go in the barn. They used to go in the barn and actually have these little BB guns, and they'd have BB gun fights. I remember that, and I never really wanted to partake because I felt like I could seriously get hurt doing that. But that was the late 50s, late 40s, early 50s, going up to high school time. So I grew up in Brewster, went through K 1 through 8, graduated in 1957 from Brewster Elementary School, which is the building that is now the town hall. So they had the south structure of that, the wing of that went on in, I believe, probably 1953, 54. That was an addition. And I actually remember my half-brother Bob was on the committee to expand the Brewster Elementary School, because they needed more room. They just didn't have the room. So they built that addition on, I think, in 1953. And at that time, I was probably in the 5th grade. So I never got a chance to use the rooms in that end of the building, because that end of the building were grades 1 through 3. Actually, no. Actually, I was in grade 3, because I was in the new building for 1 grade with Mrs. Carver. And we moved into the old building. And the funny thing about that elementary school is I still remember all those rooms. I remember my 4th grade room. It's there. It's right next to the tax collector's office. The tax collector's office, nice people in there. I was up there the other day to pay a late tax bill. And I was looking in there, that's where Mrs. Callahan made me stand up. Okay? I'll tell you, I got another story after this. Am I okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Mrs. Callahan made me stand up one day, 16 kids, because she'd do the vocabulary lesson. And you had to spell the word and give a definition. And my word was handicapped. I spelled it, but I couldn't come up with a definition for what the word handicapped meant. I stood by the desk, I swear to God, for a good 5 minutes or more, just standing there. She wouldn't say a word. Nobody would say anything in the class. And I never did come up with a definition. She finally asked me to sit down. And that's my 5th grade classroom. That's a memory of Mrs. Callahan in there. So and then all those rooms, I remember every bit of that school.
Did you have a shop when you were there?
We did have a shop. Downstairs, downstairs,
Mm-hmm.
next to the boiler room, Frank Robbins was the janitor. Oh, he was a character. He lived right across the street from me in Brewster, Frank Robbins. He was the janitor there for years. And every once in a while, I'll tell you about the shop, but I have another quick story. The school was heated with coal. There was an old coal furnace down in the basement. And every once in a while, you'd get to go down. Ozzie Burst would pick a couple of guys out to go down in the boiler room with Frank. Oh, that was fun. And you'd get to go down there and shovel the coal. And the big coal shovels. And you'd take the shovel of coal and throw it in the burner. And that was a big thing to get to do that, I'll tell you. Then we had a shop class that was downstairs. It was on the west side of the building,
Mm-hmm.
underneath the 4th and 5th grade rooms. And we had shop, and we learned how to use tools. And I'm much appreciative of that, because I can use tools today, hand tools, I learned how to hammer a nail, how to saw a piece of wood, how to use a jigsaw, nothing powered, all by hand. And I can't think of the shop teacher's name. He lived up in West Brewster on 6A. Can't think of his name. Maybe we can research that.
Okay.
And we made little shelves. We made a footstool. We made a little bench with a drawer in it. We made a sailboat. about a 3-foot sailboat, which I think I still have up in the garage. And we learned how to do woodworking, basic woodworking. And you know, I look back on that and I say, gee, you know, some of the little things, I still have the things we made, some of the things we made. And the women and the girls, they couldn't go to shop. They had a sewing teacher, Mrs. Crowley. Remember her?
Well,
Wasn't it Crowley?
Geraldine Kroll.
Kroll, Mrs. Kroll, Geraldine Kroll. Geraldine Kroll was
Yeah,
this.
she taught me.
She taught you too, sure. Oh, here's a good one. Here's a good one. Mrs. Laporte, my 4th grade teacher, right? I had her for 4th grade. I'm going to say, I guess it was probably 1955. No, 54. So my children were born here in town, and my daughter Cassandra went through the Brewster Elementary School system, not to that school, to the new Brewster Elementary School up on Underpass Road, and got into 4th grade, and Mrs. Laporte says, I know your dad. And she says, oh my God. And then my son went 2 years later, and she said the same thing. I know your dad. I had your dad in 4th grade. Mrs. Laporte was there for a long time.
Yep, and she's been interviewed as part of
And
this
she really,
project.
oh my
Yep.
God, what a lovely woman.
Yep.
Yeah. And I was talking to, something came up on the phone the other night. My daughter's a professor at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. She's an English professor. And we were talking about, the interview with the president's wife, the ex-president, Mrs. Obama. Sorry, I think I'm fading a little bit on the names. I'm not so good on the names anymore. Okay, I'm Michelle Obama. And my wife was saying that she counted 10 likes. Like when I was a young woman in Chicago and I was going to school, and you know, today, you know, the vocabulary and the way we talk to each other has changed. Maybe a lot because of the internet, I'm not sure. But the word like is a word that is used in conversation today frequently, especially by young people. Not like so much like us. But and so I was just talking to my daughter last night and I said, hey, do they teach grammar anymore in the elementary school? She says, yeah, they do. They have language arts and they teach it. She says, but they don't teach it like they taught it to us. And she meant her and me with Mrs. Laporte. I mean, when we came out of elementary school, I mean, there would be critics of what I'm going to say, I'm sure. But we knew our grammar. We knew that not was an adverb. We knew the parts of speech. We knew prepositional phrases. We knew where to put a comma, a colon, a semicolon. We knew the rules of grammar. We knew our times tables. We could do simple math without a calculator. And I say that the good days for what I consider the good days for me, because I think I capitalized on that as I went along. But it's not the same way anymore. But Mrs. Laporte was a wonderful woman. And I always think back on her as probably my favorite. Maybe Mrs. Livesey, my 1st grade teacher, was. She was a gem too. But all my teachers were good in the elementary school. But you toed the mark. You know, you didn't get away with anything, and you had to work hard to keep your grades, to have good grades. So I pictured this town. Oh, one more story. Population, 800 people. 1945, I'm short of 1960, we checked the census, it was never more than 850 people. So it was the same people in town for those 15 years that I was a young boy in the 40s and 50s. So you knew everybody in town. I could go through the town and tell you, I can't right now, but I can come close to go to every house and say, who lived in that house? The houses that are here. And I'm looking at the one right across the street and I can't remember. But I knew most of the people, you know, the Lund house next door, and I just know most of them. But I had one more story to tell you, and I forgot it.
Well, let me ask you about some of the other adults that were in your immediate neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, for example,
Right. Across the street from me, Skip's mom and dad, Jim and Dot Daly. Dot was a teacher, although she didn't teach during the years that she had 3 children. Skip was my age. Carol was younger, and then they had a younger boy named Paul. And Dot was a school teacher. Jim was worked for Cushman Bakery He drove the Cushman bakery truck. And I don't know if you, people probably wouldn't know what that is, but it was a delivery service for baked goods. And it was a company that was quite popular in the 40s and 50s. And he'd go over off of the highway somewhere and fill up his truck in the morning with baked goods, donuts and pastries and breads. And then he'd go off and he'd peddle it around the neighborhoods in Brewster and Orleans. Jim Dale, that was his job. Of course, when he'd come home at night, he'd park the truck in his garage. And Skip and I used to go in there and break in through the back door and steal his donuts. Because they were good, man. And he caught on every once in a while because he took an inventory. But that was one of the things we used to do, was get in the Cushman bakery truck. Next door to me was my half-sister and Faith's grandmother. Faith lived there, and Kay. And Kay had a daughter, Stephanie, who was my age and my sister's age. And we used to play together. And next door to them were the Robbinses. And their daughter lived there, and she grew up with us. And then adjacently across the street were Roland and Althea Hall. Right next to the Tower House was Ted and Jean Ellis. Just next door to the Dailies was some elderly folks, Flora Foster and Delia Foster. Mm-hmm. I used to remember my mom used to make me go over there Sunday morning and visit my Aunt Flora and my Aunt Delia. And they were really elderly when I was like 5 years old. They were like in their 80s. And then next door to them were the Coakleys. Adjacently across the street to the east of my house were the Hopkinses. They had Charlie Hopkins, Samuel Hopkins, Sarah Hopkins, all kids that grew up with me. Further east than that was Gardner Chase, and Gardner Chase lived on the corner of Millstone Road and 6A. He raised chickens for Mayo's Duck Farm. He had buildings out behind his house. At one time, he had as many as 40,000 hens. 40,000 hens.
On that property?
In that property, in those long buildings going out there. What did he do with them? He'd raise them to a certain size. They'd take them down to Orleans at Mayo's Duck Farm, and they'd prepare them for slaughter and marketing. That was Gardner Chase. And Gardner Chase, he had a daughter. He had 3 children. Kenny, who lives in Orleans. Louisa, who married Billy Livesey, Livesey was my first grade teacher's son. And they lived in Florida. And Barbara. And Barbara was my girlfriend. In the 4th grade, I was pretty sweet on Barbara Chase. So we used to go down there because she was a little bit of a tomboy, Barbara was. And they had a really nice basketball court. So we'd go down there in November, December after school and play basketball out in her court. And we always had a good time down there. Across the street from them were the Koches up near the sea camps. Grant Koch had two daughters, were kind of my age. Much further east than that, there weren't too many people. The McGregors lived down there, but that was, and then if I moved further west, I could tell you a quick story about Chillingsworth. Chillingsworth, a restaurant now, when I was growing up, was a doctor's office. It was a house and a doctor's office. Dr. Renee Murad, who was a physician, an MD, and he was German. And he had a doctor's office in there. And he had children, but they were younger than us. And then a little further to the west, still standing, was the old Bassett house. The Bassett children were all older than I were. They were all older than me. And then I get way up where I was telling you about Ozzie Burst lived next to the coffee shop, was Bunny Burst lived there. And
can I ask you about Phobia Foster?
Oh yeah, of course. Some of the people in town that were not my contemporaries, more my dad's, were really characters. And just behind the Tower House, you know when I say the Tower House is it's a restaurant now. Well, that's where Faith lived when she grew up. She lived in the Tower House. It was my half brother's house. I think my dad gave it to him. My dad probably gave it to him. And he said, Ted, here, you take the Tower House, and you live there. So they grew up in the Tower House. Just behind the Tower House were a couple of small houses, and in one of them, there was a gentleman by the name of Foster, Phobia Foster. Phoebe, Phobia Foster. Almost like I think it's more of a woman's name.
Well, I think I've
Was
seen
it
it
Phobia?
spelled F-O-B-E, but his
Oh,
real name, I
really?
believe, was Charles.
Oh, okay, I saw it on the tombstone, you're right, it was
Yep.
Charles Foster.
Yep.
But they called him Phobia.
They called him Phobia.
Yeah. Okay, Phobia was a carpenter. He was a craftsman. He could build a house. Phobia could build a house. So next to his house, he had a wood shop, a woodworking shop, with really big power tools. I remember going in there, big table saws, and big belts on these saws where he'd take a actual tree and cut it up into boards for lumber for a house. Phobia, and he was a character. Boy, he had the smell of an old piece of pine wood. Every time I smelled him, he wore an old set of overalls, always had a pair of gloves on, and he had a little pair of wire glasses, and you'd always ask him, "How you doing, Mr. Phobia?" "Backwards, boy, I'm doing backwards." That's all he'd say. And everybody would laugh.
I'm doing backwards?
Doing backwards. "How you doing, boy? How you doing, Mr. Foster?" I'm doing backwards. I'm doing backwards." That's what he used to say. And that's how he remembered Phobia. And then there was, then down another, okay, and then I can tie this into some of my life. Phobia Foster lived there. He was a friend of my dad's. Actually, if you go back in the historical records and you want to see how the town of Brewster is mapped out, a lot of the original survey lines and prints of the lines of the boundaries of Brewster were laid out by Phobia Foster. He was an engineer. He was an MIT graduate. He was a civil engineer. So he used to take his transit out in the woods and he'd survey the back 40 and lay out a lot of the boundary lines for the town of Brewster and for other people in town. I remember him up off of Millstone Road surveying some land for my dad, a bunch of woodland up there. And he was also a carpenter, you know. And then, okay, so I got to introduce another guy. Further east, going down beyond Helen McGregor's house, a little further on down than that, on the left-hand side, there was a house where Arthur Chase lived. Now, Arthur Chase was a character. He was an old townie. He lived in kind of a dilapidated old house right off of 6A. I think it's since been demolished.
I think it's still
Or is it
there,
still
but
there,
it's
but it's
kind
been
of,
remodeled?
it's tucked in.
Yeah.
And it's located in between
The
the
sea camps.
and that little
road.
Chapman Lane, I think.
Yeah.
It's in that part of 6.
Actually, okay, so here's a story about Art. Art lived in the old house. The east side of the house was falling off the house. It was a 2-story cape. He took a long pipe. Well, I think he thought at some point in time that wasn't going to hold up. So he decided he was going to build himself a house. So next door to this house, he had a foundation dug, had the cinder block foundation put in. He put a deck on it, put tar paper on it, never built the house. Moved into that as his house. Lived there with his wife and 3 children for a number of years. I want to say 10, 15 years. Lived in the basement with just a deck on the top. He never built the house. There was a story, and I don't want to belittle him at all, because this guy was kind of like a mechanical genius. He could take a car apart and put it back together again, nut and bolt, electrical generators. He was just a self-made engineering kind of guy. But I think in those days, a lot of people were. He used to hang out at the dump, and he'd go up there and take the old motors off the refrigerators, and take motors and just bring them home and put them in and fix them. And then every once in a while, if you needed something, you'd go see Art Chase. If you needed an armature from a generator or something, he'd have it probably down in the cellar, or he could get it for you. So he was really a character. He was also a carpenter. At one point in time, my dad, we owned some land down off of Ellis Landing. We actually my family owned the whole tract of land from Ellis Landing right down to the bay, all that land. And my grandfather and my dad had built some cottages down there. And just to make a long story short, in the late 40s, my dad had built 4 or 5, 6 cottages down there. 3 of them were built by Phobia Foster and Arthur Chase. And I got to throw another character into the mix. The other character was from West Brewster. He also lived in a house that was just a foundation with a deck on it. And his name was Vinnie Sears. He was a mason. He was a mason. I mean a brick mason. Yeah. He was a brick mason. So Phobia and Art would put up the superstructures of the cottages, and Vinny would do the brickwork. He'd put the footings in for the foundation. No foundations, just put them up on cinder blocks in those days. And he'd build a fireplace, and Art and Phobia would come in, and they're all the old cottages. We still have a couple of them left. A lot of them have been knocked down. But the old ones that are left, they have the old pine boards in them, the tongue and groove pine boards. And they're very rustic, but they're classic, you know. As a matter of fact, my dad made shutters for these cottages, and he made them out of just pine boards. And he cut out with a little jigsaw sailboats and put a sailboat on every shutter all the way around the cottage. So I thought that was cool, and just this year, we have one cottage right on the beachfront, and we reshingled it and put some new windows in it last year. So I made some shutters for her. I said, well, I'm going to make the shutters just like my dad did. I took them down I had to take the pattern. I took the pattern down to Mid-Cape to get the lumber, and the woman at that desk helped me, and she was so excited that I was going to do this that I felt like after I did it and I finished the shutters, you're going to go down and take a look at these shutters.
I am going.
They have the little sailboats on them, just like my dad made. And those are the original sailboats that are on these shutters on the cottages up in the back, and I made them just like it for the beachfront one. I took one down to the woman at Mid-Cape and showed it to her. Oh my God, I thought she couldn't believe it, you know? She said, you spent that? I spent like $200 for the lumber to make 10 pairs of shutters, which wasn't bad. And she said, you made those shutters like this? She said, I'm not a craftsman, but I will say this, is that during my education at the elementary school, I had a lot of confidence in using a saw. I did use some power equipment to do these shutters with, but I mean, I got that from my early education. And I think from hanging out with my dad early on. And then another thing that I learned as a young man was I learned plumbing. Because when I was in high school, my uncle, William Porteous, who lived on Ellis Landing Road, the house now then it went to my sister, and now it's been bought by somebody else, and they're putting a swimming pool in there, I say, or something like that. And my uncle was a plumber. So I used to hang out with him in the summer sometimes, and he'd teach me plumbing skills. How to sweat a joint and how to put the pipes together and put a silcock on. And so, you know, I mean, I look back on that. And then even to go a generation ahead, because my son called me the other night from Texas, and he said, Dad, he says, I had a problem with my pool pump. He said, the capacitor's gone. And he says, Dad, how would I know how to replace a capacitor? He says, I remember when we were fixing that motor in the cellar, and he's going back and telling me that he appreciates the things that he learned from me that help him be handy around his house, you know, how to put a washer on a faucet, how to replace a frayed wire. I mean, these are things that I think a lot of kids today don't know that, you know. I mean, they know a lot of other things that are probably much more important. But I look back on those years and think about those things I learned and how important they were to me, and my son too. So I forget where I was.
So let's circle back a little bit, because we have a story that's kind of interesting. And so first of all, your father's name is
Gilbert E. Ellis Jr.
And your grandfather's name was
Gilbert E. Ellis Sr.
And you're the third.
I'm the third. I've kind of dropped that from my title because it's somewhat laborious. Because when you do that with legal documents, they make you keep doing it, you know. On a deed, I have to sign the third because that's the way it was way back when. But I've tried to drop it off my license and other forms because it's kind of a pain.
But it's helpful in understanding the family piece
because it puts the errors in, you know. It puts the time frames in.
Right.
So like my grandfather was 1860 to 1873 to 1940. My father was 1888 to 1953. I'm 1943 to present. I'm still here, and it's the errors. And then we went back one generation before, and my great grandfather, his name was Thaddeus Ellis. Thaddeus Ellis, and he lived in Brewster. He lived in the old house that is right across the street from the Catholic Church, from the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church. My cousin, her cousin, Ann, lives there now. This is my half-brother's daughter, Ann. And they have a historical marker on that house because that house, I think, is circa 16 something. 1680?
I'm not sure of the date,
Yeah,
but it's one of
It's
the oldest
one of the oldest
houses.
houses. And Thaddeus Ellis, my great-grandfather, lived in that house. His grave is up at the Red Top Cemetery. I found his gravestone and his wife.
And Thad Ellis Road is named
Thad
after
Ellis Road
him.
is named after him. Yeah. And Ellis Landing, of course, is named after my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so your immediate to the west neighbor
Was
growing up.
my half-sister Catherine, and she lived there with Stephanie, her daughter, and a little bit later on, Kay was divorced. I don't remember her husband. His name was Law, and she had a daughter, Stephanie, wonderful, wonderful woman, young lady, woman today. And Kay remarried at a later date a gentleman from, I believe, Quincy, and Dick, Richard Hart, and he had two boys, Daniel and David. And then, and she also had a child with Dick. His name was Eric. So they all lived there when I was growing up. In addition, on the side of the house, Kay had a little apartment for her mother, Faith, her grandmother, and they lived there, and we lived in the house just to the east. And I was telling the story about the clotheslines.
So just to be clear,
Yeah.
Faith and Clara were both married to your father.
Right. Faith was my father's first wife, her true grandmother. My Gilbert Ellis Jr. divorced Faith, married my mother, Clara Hibbert, who came from Nova Scotia into Hyannis.
Yep.
And then she had 3 children. I was a son, two daughters. And we grew up there in those 2 houses.
Which were about the houses?
Yeah,
were
they were
about,
like from here to across the street.
Right.
You know, 100 feet apart.
Right.
100 feet apart. And I can remember, I don't know if this was recorded or not, probably not. I remember my mother and Faith both being outside of their houses in the fall, spring sometime, hanging clothes on the clothesline and being 50 feet apart. Never a word was spoken. It was never brought up. But it was a little bit awkward because I used to hang out with Stephanie, and I used to hang out at her aunt's house,
Mm-hmm.
Kay.
Mm-hmm.
I used to hang out at Kay's house. But when I went there with Johnny and Chip and maybe Chris, and she might have been, I don't know. Faith was their grandmother, but Faith was my grandmother. And I always felt awkward, and I think she did a little bit too. I don't think she knew exactly what to say to me, because she never excluded me,
Mm-hmm.
but she never really included me either.
Okay.
And I had that sense, you know,
Yeah.
and I can understand why. It was
Yeah.
hard for her probably, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm in the middle of the thing trying to figure out
Right.
what is going on, you
And
know.
the other thing I will add is that Faith Ellis was librarian
Oh, yeah.
here for many years.
50 years.
It feels like 50, I'm
Well,
sure,
maybe,
but
yeah.
it was
30
certainly
to 50.
around
Yeah.
30 years,
Right,
I
right,
think.
yeah. Yeah, Faith Ellis was a very well-educated woman, very well-read, and very intelligent lady. So she was just a wonderful woman.
So that's a little bit of insight into the
Yeah, that's a little bit of insight.
tangled
And I will
web
say,
of
yeah, the
the
tangled
Ellis
web.
family.
But on the other hand, because we were speaking earlier about the tangled webs in those situations, sometimes in these small towns, as being a little bit more intricate than that. But in Brewster, as far as I know, and I think back on all the people I know, there were very few households where there was a divorce. Very few. All the kids I know of were with their regular parents.
I think that's true.
You know?
I think that's
I'm
true.
sure there were a couple, but not like, it wasn't rampant. It was very unusual. Because I can remember going to the elementary school events, the concerts and things, and always it was the mother and father, Roland and Althea, Gardner and little Mrs. Chase,
Mhm.
Jim and Dot Daly.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
always the same people,
Yeah.
Alan and Doe. All the same parents were always there. Except for me, I didn't have a dad. But that's okay, I got through it.
Right.
My mother did a great job. She did a great job with me.
Right,
through
here
all
you
it,
are.
too.
Right.
Yeah, here I am.
Right.
Still kicking. So,
So one of the things that we had talked about, and I'm wondering if you'd like to, or if you would talk about, is your whole Vietnam experience. If you could, it's
yeah,
so you can talk about
yeah, okay.
Well, first of all, were you drafted or
No,
did
no,
you
no.
enlist?
When I was at the University of New Hampshire in '63, I could a lot of us could kind of see the writing on the wall as far as the draft was concerned. So I joined the ROTC, which was an option at that time in my junior year. And so that got me into, I knew I was going to have to go in the military, but I knew I would go in as an officer, which might have been of some benefit to me, you know. So I was ROTC, so when I graduated in '65, I was commissioned a second lieutenant. And I guess I could pick up on it from there. I was a biology major, and I had interest in medicine. So I wasn't going to be able to go to medical school then. And so I figured I could at least apply to try to get into a branch of the Army that would have maybe some medical interest to me and help out. And I applied to get into the Medical Service Corps, which was kind of like the administrative end of the medical arena. Paperwork types of things, looking at how to organize medical facilities, how to operate a field hospital, and how to do basic, medical intervention, first aid types things. So I did. I got in there. I went down to Fort Sam Houston for 16 weeks, and it went into a program called the Battalion Surgeon's Assistant Course. It wasn't quite as intensive as a PA program, but it was a program kind of like where they were training me to be kind of like a battlefield. At the time I kind of felt like I was going to end up in Vietnam, but I was kind of hoping I wouldn't. But I went through this and really pretty intense training program called a Battalion Surgeon's Assistant Course. And it involved, making small incisions, suturing, injecting, doing, emergency first aid type stuff. Mm-hmm. So I did that, and I immediately got sent to Vietnam. So I went over to Vietnam in 1966, in August 24th of '66. And all the years I grew up in town, I grew up with this kid, Skip, he was my friend. Well, he went away to Springfield College. And when he got out of college, he was going to be drafted, but he fortunately got an option to go into officer candidate school. So he went that route. He didn't go into ROTC at Springfield. I don't know that they had it, but he went to OCS, and he went out to California. And he trained to be an officer, and he was an officer, but he was in the infantry. So, strange thing. He was shipped out to Vietnam on August 24th, and I think I was shipped out to Vietnam on August 26th of 1966. He was in California, and at the time I was shipped out, I was down in North Carolina at Fort Bragg. We both went to Vietnam. We both ended up in the 1st Cavalry Division. We both ended up in the same brigade. No, I'm sorry. We both ended up in the same division, 1st Cavalry Division, which had 3 brigades. I was in the 1st Brigade, and he was in the 2nd Brigade. There's probably about 7,000 troops in each brigade, so out of the 7,000, I was like 2 and 14,000. We were right in the same area. Mm-hmm. I didn't actually know he was there. I mean, I knew he was in Vietnam, but I didn't know exactly where he was until one day we were out in the field. I don't know what we were doing. There's some helicopters landing, and it was like we were in the middle of a battlefield somewhere. And I ran across him, and I couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. And he told me that he was this was in January of '66. So he told me that he was on his way for an R&R. They had these times when you were in Vietnam, if you'd been there for 6 months, 5 or 6 months, you could go away for 3 or 4 days to kind of relax. They call it rest and relaxation. And I think he was going to Singapore for 5 days. So I said, yeah, I'll look you up when we come back, we'll get together. So he came back, and I didn't get a chance to see him. And of course, he went back out to his unit out in the field, and he was in an ambush patrol at night up in the Central Highlands, and his position got overrun by a small North Vietnamese unit. And he had like 23, 24 guys in this perimeter, and he was in a little foxhole, and he took a hand grenade in the foxhole and picked it up to throw it out, but fortunately it went off, so he was killed. He died there, and it was pretty traumatic. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it might be for me right now. I don't want to choke up too much, but I have to look back at that, and geez, that's tough. So his parents were so insistent that they get me out of the country. There were probably 15 or 20 of us guys from Brewster in Vietnam at that time. There were a number of us over there.
Yeah.
12, I'd say at least.
Yeah, we interviewed Dana.
Dana Condon,
Yeah,
yeah. And so, but his parents, because they were my next door neighbors, and all they could think of was to get me out of there. So of course, in the military, if you were an officer and you were killed in action, your escort had to be an officer of at least equal rank. So I was a lieutenant and he was a lieutenant. So they asked if I could become his escort. And I didn't want to do it. I said no. I was over there and I said, I can't do that. I said, you're asking me to take the guy's body back to Brewster? I said, I just can't do it, you know? So they ordered me to do it. They ordered me to do it. His parents were really insistent. So I did it, and then it was, I don't want to know if you want me to go through all that or
yeah.
not.
It was such as you and I were talking, it was a huge and terrible event here in Brewster,
yeah.
and you were really in the middle of it.
Yeah, I know.
And
I know, and I look back on it now, and I told Faith the other day is that, I would think that maybe in a normal situation that might have caused me some pretty serious mental, rearrangement of how am I going to get through this in my life, I mean, the guys coming back from Iraq today and Iran, they're seeing probably a lot worse than what I saw, But I don't know how they deal with it, but I tried to put it behind me I'll tell you quickly, the story was I got here, I flew to Washington, I flew to Dover Air Force Base, picked up his casket, was on board with it from the morgue at Dover Air Base, on the train in Philadelphia, up to Boston. Casket goes in the hearse gets driven to Orleans to Nickerson Funeral Home. Nickerson Funeral Home, I live at 25 Ellis Landing Road, my mom's house. She had just built. Mm-hmm. And I get out of the hearse and walk down. A guy says, do you want me to drive you into your driveway? I said, no, just let me off here on 6A. I walk across the street. Who's coming up Ellis Landing Road? But Skip's dad, driving the Mobile oil truck that was owned by Chet Williams. There's a lot of other things here I'm not telling you about. Chet Williams was a guy who lived in a little house on Ellis Landing Road, and he had an oil business. He distributed heating oil. Jim Daly drove his truck to do the deliveries for a number of years. So I'm walking down the road, here's Jim Daly driving up, jams the brakes on, gets out of the truck, embraces me.
And how old were you?
I was 24.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So I had all the paperwork and the orders and the attaché, and I was on specific orders of what to do, and I was to immediately upon arrival was to change into my regular dress uniform, go to the house, present myself. I had a thing I was supposed to say on behalf of the United States government. I can't say that.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
But I had to do that, but he intercepted me. So then I had to go do that it was late afternoon when I went up to see Doc.
Yeah.
So.
Oh my gosh.
And the funeral arrangements and all that. So anyway,
Well, I appreciate you telling the story.
Yeah, I don't mind telling.
Really.
I actually do. I actually have down in Miami for the veterans. I gave a presentation on Vietnam. I have a pretty nice PowerPoint presentation of now and then, and I have it set up so that I show. I went back with my son in 2013
to Vietnam.
To Vietnam.
Yeah.
And my son and I went back, and we went to all the places that I had been. And I was up in the mountains in the Central Highlands. We went back to as close as we could to where Skip was killed at a place called LZ English, a landing zone, where helicopters would come in and drop the troops off and set up some more. These were little places where the fights were going on. And I was actually a medical service corps officer, and I was in charge of 36 medics. And all of my medics were assigned out to the infantry platoons that were in these companies. So Skip had a platoon and he had a medic. So all my platoons in my battalion were all my medics. And a number of them were killed. I say that two of my medics, two of the young boys that were in my platoons that I had assigned out, Charlie Hagemeister, who was a 19-year-old kid from Lincoln, Nebraska, he got the Medal of Honor. I don't want to go through all what he did, but it was heroic. He's alive today, and he's a retired colonel, actually. He was a PFC. No, he was a Spec 4 at the time. He was an enlisted kid. He was a young Coke bottle glasses coming from Lincoln, Nebraska. And then another one of my medics, Ed McWethy, he got the Medal of Honor. These are rare awards. And Chris just looked up, my son just looked up at Texas Christian University, TCU. They have the largest Vietnamese archive library of anywhere in the country. And my son loves going through that stuff. He's a historian. He isn't really. He's a biologist, but then he was a Signal Corps officer in the Army. But he loves going through this stuff. And he found the field written citation on this kid Ed McWethy, who gave his life and saved 4 guys in this platoon. Took 2 gunshots in the head, and still was able to function for a short period of time before he died.
Yeah.
And he got it posthumously. But
Wow.
I mean, I look back in those days and some of those kids and all the things we went through. I spent a lot of time over there. I had this little picture here.
Yep.
Oh, during the time I was there, of course the war was not favorable in the United States. It was a little more favorable in '66 than it was in '67 and '8. But I mean, it was really bad then. But one of the things that the U.S. government thought they'd try under General Westmoreland was this pacification program in '66, where rather than tell the Viet Cong and the NVA how bad they were, they try to win them over. Oh, we'll help you build new buildings and give you medical care and build you schools. So I actually got assigned for 3 months while I was there to work on one of these pacification missions, which was to go out in these little rural hamlets way out in the middle of nowhere in the jungle and bring out first aid materials, bring out wood, lumber, metal, and have the engineers come out and build showers and build little aid stations and bring farm tools for these people that they could use, thinking that, oh, you can have a better life if you come to the American side. We're trying to win over the Viet Cong. It didn't work. We'd go back there a month later and everything's gone, They just took it. The NVA took it and just put it in their coffers. And that was, so here, this picture here was, we did a lot of aid calls, and this little girl had really cut her finger badly, and I patched it up and we put a few stitches in it for her. And I mean, these little kids were, they were ravaged. They had sores and bites and wounds all over them, and they had no way to keep clean, and they bathed in the rivers, and it was really sad, So I often would have said, if I could have ever gone back and found that girl, not a chance.
Yeah. So I'm just curious about the photo. Who took it? Was it used?
No. They had assigned to our units military photographers.
Okay.
And this particular little mission, they had a photographer out there.
Okay.
So I think this picture was actually in the Army journal, the Army paper or something.
Yep.
So,
well, it's a great picture.
Yeah, it
really
is.
is a nice picture.
Yeah, look how young I look.
Yeah, I thought that too when I saw it.
Jeez, Ellis. I actually have my University of New Hampshire ring on.
I was noticing that as well.
Yeah. So I think we've probably used up our time.
I think we have. We've talked for over an hour, so I think we probably.
I hope it was enlightening, and that if there's anything I could do to.
Well, some people
fill
we
in
have
the
come
blanks.
back, so we might have to do part 2.
Well, I'd be
your adult years.
I'd be more than happy to come back. I do my adult years, yeah.
So.
I mean, I tried to fill in the best I could.
No, I thought it was
on the 40s and 50s.
Really, really great.
And I will say that in parting that this town has changed so much in the past 40 years. It's so much different than it was when I was growing up. But I still think it has a lot of charm, and there's a lot of memories for me here, and I'm sure for Faith too. So I would never want to say that it hasn't changed for the better. And I guess as when we look at what is progress, I guess we've made a lot of progress. We've made a lot of progress. And so I think from that standpoint, the people that live in Brewster now are fortunate to have the things they do, and it's a pretty nice town. It's a pretty nice town.